message.
And so in Acts 15, you've got Peter presenting his view, Barnabas and Paul their view. James stands up, presents his view, and at the end what happens? Everybody agrees and they live happily ever after. Well, Bauer would say, we know that's not true. James and Paul hated each other in the early church. I mean, look at James' 2nd chapter of his little epistle versus the 4th chapter of Paul's Romans. One says that it's all by works. The other says it's all by faith. They're opposed to one another. So how can you explain Acts 15 except it's non-historical? It didn't happen. This was written by a 2nd century A.D. Christian looking back, trying to smooth over the differences of the two parties. Or take the passage in chapter 21. Could we ever really find the Apostle Paul agreeing to some Nazarite paying the money, shaving the head vow type ceremony, the apostle of freedom and liberty and grace? Or take Acts 16. Paul circumcises Timothy. But when you take his real epistle, Galatians chapter 2, he refused to circumcise Titus. Circumcision was of the law of works. Salvation was by grace through faith. So you can't have the same man doing both of them, circumcising one time and not the other time. Not anyway in Bauer's theory. You see, what Bauer failed to understand is there's a better way of understanding what appears to be an incongruity. If you just study the situation in Acts 16, and Luke gives us enough information, we can see why on that occasion Paul would have someone circumcised, whereas on another occasion he wouldn't. We don't have to explain the earlier of those, Acts 16, as being written by some sympathizing 2nd century A.D. Christian. And then you see Bauer has other problems, all right? He tells us Galatians. I mean, they really like Galatians as being definitely a Pauline book. I mean, it's an anti-book. This is free, free, free. No works, no law, nothing to do with Moses. Well, then what about Galatians 3 and verse 28? This reads like a synthesis passage. All right? If you're following my train of thought, Galatians 3:23, there is neither Jew nor Gentile. There's neither bond nor free. There's neither male nor female. For ye are all one in Christ Jesus. That's a synthesis passage there. That shouldn't be found in Romans, Galatians, 1st or 2nd Corinthians. That should be found in some other New Testament book. Not in one of the 4 Pauline ones, which are anti-Jewish, anti-law, anti-legalism. Verse 29, if ye be Christ, then are ye Abraham's seed. Abraham was the founder of the Jewish people and heirs according to the promise. Paul, according to Bauer's theory, should never be appealing back to Abraham for something like this. So you see, this theory, which is nothing but a theory, has some very fatal flaws in it, I'm afraid. All right, let's go on with the time we've got left to whatever we can discuss here. That's the Tübingen criticism. See, what that causes you to do then, you redate almost all the New Testament books. They weren't written by who you thought they were, or to whom you thought they were, or why or when you thought they were. That affects all of New Testament introduction then. If the Tübingen school is right, it throws us completely out into left field, or right field, or wherever. Because we have to redate everything, reevaluate everything, and read into it 2 warring factions in the early church. Now, there were not warring factions, there were growing pains to be experienced. And we've explained this on other tapes before. When you've been raised a Jew for centuries upon centuries, you don't just give it up overnight for a gospel that doesn't have anything to do with laws or holidays or holy ceremonies or anything. That was a gradual process. Paul the Apostle happened, according to Galatians 1, to have been given direct, special, specific revelation about the good news, the gospel of grace and faith. And he came on perhaps a little more strongly than did the others. But then again, we see them, such as Peter in Acts 10, coming on strong as well. God is no respecter of persons, said Peter. Okay, source criticism. This is another way of looking at the New Testament. Source criticism. This was the attempt to go back beyond the New Testament canon and look for the sources of some of the writings. For an example from the Old Testament, we studied this in OT Intro. It appears that Moses might have used some sources for at least some of his Pentateuchal material. He talks about the book of the wars of the Lord, the book of Jasher. He talks about the generations, the Toledot in the book of Genesis. He talks about a book concerning Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 5 and verses 1 and 2. Or take the book of Chronicles. The books of Chronicles, or the one Jewish Hebrew book of Chronicles, obviously made use of the book of Samuels and Kings. So source criticism would be asking, what was the source of the material that the chronicler used? Well, he took some from Samuel and Kings. So when you come to the New Testament, they want to go behind Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and ask the same question. What were the sources for the written material? This was especially true with the Synoptic Gospels. For instance, you'll become familiar with this date and this man's name and this event more later. In 1835, Karl Lachmann, Lachmann, Karl Lachmann, published his theory of Markan priority. It's Markan, M-A-R-C-A-N. In other words, that Mark was the first gospel to be written. That's in layman's terms for the technical Markan priority. Markan priority simply means Mark was the first gospel to be written. That has become the dominant view in conservative and non-conservative circles alike down to 1988. That is the dominant view. Okay, so if Mark was written first, then their hypothesis was that the other synoptic writers, by name Matthew and Luke, borrowed from Mark. This is part of source criticism. And Lachmann's basis for this was the fact that the latter two, you need to get this down, Matthew and Luke, never agree. They never agree to disagree with Mark. This will be on page 2 when we discuss the synoptic question. How many of you know what the synoptic question is all about? All right, so New Testament studies. Matthew and Luke never agree to disagree with Mark. All right, let me just give you a for example here. Well, we're just going to have to go a little bit longer. I'm not going to stop 60 minutes tonight, right in the middle of all of this. Need to get through with this. Let's say that Mark has, we'll put Mark up here as first gospel. Mark has, X material in his gospel, chapter 4, verse 8 or whatever. All right, and Mark is telling a certain story about Jesus healing a man. All right, Matthew tells that same story. He tells it very, very similarly. So perhaps Matthew borrowed some from Mark. All right, then Luke may tell another story that's included in his 8th chapter that's in Mark's 10th chapter. All right, so he borrowed, perhaps from Mark. But what we never have Mark saying something and then Matthew and Luke being over here on the same side, on the same issue, disagreeing with what Mark has to say. So statistically, it makes a lot of sense that these two did a lot of borrowing from Mark since they never agree to disagree with the Gospel of Mark. This is Lachmann's whole theory, the basis of his whole theory. And I'm not saying I disagree entirely with that. So somebody had to write first. And as we'll get into in a little more detail later, we don't have a problem with some New Testament author borrowing from another. That doesn't lessen our view of inspiration or authority or reliability or anything on that order or anything related to that. But then this just went to all types of extreme. Who borrowed from whom? And then this one borrowed from that one. And then a minute discussion of every situation where this one got this from that, from them, which is, as any sane person will admit, absolutely impossible to do. One writer gives a good example of, remember Tatian's diatessaron? Tatian's diatessaron, a so-called harmony of the Gospels. It was a harmony of the four Gospels. So what he did, he got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. People are still doing it today, trying to write a harmony of the Gospels and weave all the material together. You know how some Gospels will tell a story, maybe two of them tell it and two of them don't. And then here one tells it and none of the other three do. And then like the feeding of the 5,000 or the crucifixion, all four tell it. So any overlapping material has to be either meshed together or cut out so that you've got one connected narrative, one scene there together. Well, how would you like to read Tatian's diatessaron and infallibly extract from that what Mark said, what Matthew said, what Luke said, what John said? That would be impossible. Once the account was woven together in a complete fashion, it'd be impossible to go back and with certainty say we know which part of this represents Matthew's contribution versus Mark's versus Luke's versus John's. And then what if Matthew and Mark happen to agree in their earlier account verbally anyway? Well, you would never know that. Not once you have Tatian's diatessaron that weaves all of this together. So Lockman may have been onto something, the fact that Mark in priority is something that could help us understand the agreement, a very large agreement. I'll give you the percentage of verses. You know, there's a certain percentage of verses that Mark has, that Matthew has, that Luke has. And Mark has only a very, very few things that are not found in at least one of the others, whereas the others have a lot not found in Mark. And John has almost everything found in no one. So someone's borrowing and someone isn't, so Lockman would inform us. This is basically a synoptic question, as you'll see later, source criticism. It's used for other things, but basically it's used with the four Gospels. Then in the third place, form criticism. I don't think I gave you the German names, but you often, I don't know why you don't see it for some of the others, but you often see the German name, if I can remember how to spell it, for form criticism, so you just soon get used to it. In English, it would be spelled like this. There, F-O-R-M-G-E-S-C-H-I-C-H-T-E. Pronounced Formgeschichte. Geschichte is German for history. Formgeschichte. You sometimes see, as we'll get to, two more later, number 5, redaction. It's spelled with a K and not a C like it is in English, but redaction Geschichte. Literally what this means then, or literally what this would translate in English would be form history. Okay, but it's often called form criticism. That's what I'm going to call it. But this term right here, Geschichte, is one to just put in your memory bank because it was made famous by Karl Barth. He had a lot to say about Geschichte versus Historie, two different German terms, both of which mean history, but two different types of history. We don't have words in English. We just have one word for history. German has two words for history, Historie and Geschichte. And that's a whole lot involved in Barthian theology. So you'll be introduced to that here in New Testament introduction. So form criticism or form Geschichte. This was presented by Martin Dibelius in 1919. Dibelius. 1919. I forget the other man who wrote a... There was something that really came out a little bit earlier, but that's pretty much a typical date for the foundation of the Formgeschichte school of New Testament criticism by Martin, M-A-R-T-I-N, Martin Dibelius of Heidelberg University in 1919. All right, this is what Formgeschichte says. The synoptic writers, notice it's again a synoptic question. So many of these concern the synoptic gospels. Not all of them, but several of them do. The synoptic writers gathered together all types of sayings that were passed down by oral tradition. Some of them were sayings of Christ, some of them were sayings about Christ. In other words, some of them were Christological discourses. Some of them were narrative accounts that Jesus went such and such a place and did such and such a thing. So sometimes you see it as the sayings of Christ and the sayings about Christ. What Christ said and what was said about him. Why don't we put a period right there for just a moment? Let me just explain something else to you that you may not have thought up. I know whenever we sit down and read Matthew, we just think of it as being God's Word to us. And that's fine and that's beautiful. These historical critical scholars have gone back before that. They don't even believe it's God's Word to begin with. They start with that presupposition. But they'll ask themselves this question. You see, what we're thinking of is we have a life of Christ here. We have the sayings of Christ and the sayings about Christ. What he said and what was said about him. But wait a minute. This is a book written by a man named Matthew. Why did Matthew write it? I mean, to us it's a part of the Bible now. But at one time it was a separate functional piece. Why did Matthew write it? What was going through his mind at the time? What made him, as you compare the Gospels, none of them say it all. They have bits and pieces. What made Matthew pick some things to say, write about, from the life and history of Jesus, and exclude or omit others? What made him pick some and exclude others? And the same question could be asked with all the Gospel writers. Why did they pick some and exclude others? For instance, the example I could give would concern Matthew 18. If a brother shall sin, verse 15, if thy brother shall sin against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. If he will not hear thee, take with thee one or two more in the mouth of three witnesses, so forth. Well, you see, the critical scholars would say, I wonder what was going on in Matthew's church. Matthew belonged to a church somewhere in the first century in the Mediterranean world. I wonder what was going on in his church that made him record this episode from the sayings of Christ. This is something that Christ said here. You see, they've got a point here. I mean, if I sat down, like my teaching right here, some of this can be kind of eternal truth, but then I wonder if bits and pieces of it aren't influenced by what you said to me before the service or what I thought about last week or what's been going on in the church. You know, you can go back and hear old tapes, and some of it's just eternal truth. It could be said by anybody at any time under any occasion. Then sometimes you hear things that you can tell that's dictated by some other situation. And so that'll introduce us to another German phrase, the Sitz in Leben phrase. And there are three of those. What is that? S-I-T-Z. I think it's I-M-L-E-B-E-N. I don't have it written down here in my notes, but it's similar to that if that's not it. The Sitz in Leben, which could be translated the life situation or the life setting. S-I-T-Z, three words, I-M-L-E-B-E-N. What was Matthew's Sitz in Leben? What was his situation, his life setting that dictated certain things to be included in his gospel, certain other things to be excluded or omitted? See, what we're doing tonight, we're not going to do this every time in NT Intro. We're really into a higher study of NT Intro. This is exactly what it's all about for a lot of people. because these are questions and problems that have been posed by other scholars in the last century. So you take the Matthew 18 situation, you'd ask yourself, what was going on in Matthew's church? Did he have a problem with a brother? Was there some rivalry in the church? Did they have a sinning member, a notoriously sinning member in the church? So he wrote a gospel, including a saying of Christ that he hoped would open the eyes to this brother or help win his side of the argument, his situation, or whatever, And then, no one can get a handle on anything. It's just your speculation against my speculation, which makes all these forms of criticism, in my estimation, completely unreliable. Now, other people have been involved in Formgeschichte besides Dibelius, and they've come up with different names for these things. Or let me say it another way. What this concerns itself with is the oral tradition stage. All right, you got 3 stages. Here's your 3 Sitzenlebens. You've got number 1, when it actually happened, when the event happened, when Jesus healed the man. That's the first life setting. It really did happen, the Sitzenleben. Then number 2, as you should probably know by now, the New Testament documents weren't written on the day of Pentecost. There was a long period of time when there weren't any New Testament books. Those stories were circulated orally. They were passed down by word of mouth. That's the second Sitzenleben situation then. That is where we are under Geschichte. We'll get to a third one with redaction here in a moment. There are really 3 Sitzenlebens. With Formgeschichte, we're concerned about the kernel of truth found in the oral stage, the stage of oral transmission or tradition. And so they would divide these sayings up into different forms, different literary forms. I'll give you the 5 better-known names for the 5 forms. Now, don't spend a lot of time memorizing all this. It's pure hypothesis. It's just nothing but speculation. But let me say something else. The oral tradition is true. The stories were passed down orally. And that's important to remember, that they didn't go around with their pockets filled with New Testament books or something. There wasn't a New Testament for several decades in the first century. They lived and preached from the Old Testament and from the memory, from the apostolic infallible memory that the apostles by word of mouth had passed down. They had been eyewitnesses. That's why one of the qualifications for an apostle to replace Judas in Acts 1 was that he must be an eyewitness of these things and of the resurrection of Christ specifically. Because the whole history, the whole life and faith of the church depended on the fact that the stories being told of them were absolutely infallibly true and reliable. You don't want a lot of fourth-hand, second-hand guessing going around. You don't have any books to base your faith on. You're basing your faith on a man who told a man who told a man who told you, I saw Jesus alive. I saw him alive. We know he was dead. We watched him die on the cross. We've got witnesses for that. The women were eyewitnesses of that. And we've seen him after his resurrection. You see, your whole faith would be based on that. Now we take it for granted because the gospel accounts all end with a bodily resurrection narrative. They didn't have that, though. They had to depend on eyewitness accounts, and these accounts were transmitted orally down for at least a couple of decades. So that is true with Formgeschichte. We should think about the oral transmission stage, but we shouldn't think about it too much, because what are you going to think about it? You can't prove anything. We don't have oral tradition. We have written tradition now, and our faith has to go on that. But anyway, here are some of the categories, or the forms. That's where they get the name form criticism. Some of the forms or literary categories of the sayings of Jesus and about Jesus. In other words, things Jesus said and things Jesus did, that they would have all of this divided up in. Number 1, the apostigm. A-P-O-T-H-E-G-M. That just means a short, pithy saying. Number 2, a miracle story. Number 3, a pronouncement story. Number 4, a paradigm. 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 And then number 5, a pericope. Pericope. What form Geschichte ends up being is nothing but a human approach to the Gospels. They are viewed merely as human literary productions. Some of the other early publishers and proponents of form Geschichte would include Rudolf Bultmann, who wrote an important article, about 19, I forget the date, I better not quote it, I look it up maybe later, but not long after Dibelius gave his presentation in 1919. C.H. Dodd, D-O-D-D, and R.H. Lightfoot. Not like the other conservative Lightfoots, this is a liberal Lightfoot. So I'd put those 4 names, there are others, but those 4 heavyweight names under form Geschichte. Martin Dibelius, Rudolf Bultmann, C.H. Dodd, R.H. Lightfoot. Okay, the 4th thing I want to mention, Lucan criticism, L-U-C-A-N, after the name Luke, Lucan criticism. Toward the end of the 19th century, many scholars began to deny either Luke's authorship of the Gospel and or Acts, or, and this was more often the case, his trustworthiness as an historian. Many critical scholars, it's called Lucan criticism, began to deny either Luke's authorship of his Gospel and or Acts, or more generally and more importantly, his trustworthiness as an historian. In other words, they didn't feel he was reliable. And there were several passages. For instance, in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Now we have about 4 tapes on this, I believe, where we answer what we think is the situation going on here. This is in IT Intro, those tapes, by the way. The so-called Quirinius problem. Came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed or enrolled. And this taxing or enrollment was first given when Cyrenius, or he's better known by his name Quirinius, was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed or enrolled, everyone into his own city. We got 4 tapes on that. We are not going to go over that again. But people feel that Luke is simply wrong here. That we can date when this took place as far as this decree from Caesar Augustus, and Quirinius was not the governor of Syria. He may have been earlier, he may be later after this time, but this would come in between those two. That Luke is simply historically wrong here. He didn't have his facts of history together, and he's wrong on this point. We've proven otherwise on those 4 tapes. In Luke 3, verses 1 and 2, they believe that he's unreliable here. 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Idumea and of the region of Trachonitis, and Lysanias, the tetrarch of Abilene. Then they don't believe that all these things are accurate. It just seems too artificial to have, when this man led over here and this one over there, then the word of God came to John in the wilderness. And especially verse 2, Annas and Caiaphas, now watch this very carefully, being the high priests. Now we're going to deal with that in a lot of detail in ITP before too long. You can't have 2 men who are high priests. You can only have one. Remember, a man was high priest until death in the Old Testament. That the murder, accidental homicide fled to what? A city of refuge until what? Until the death of the high priest in the land. The death of the high priest was very important. It was an office given, and it was a hereditary office, the sons of Aaron, and it was an office for life. Annas and Caiaphas being the high priests. You can't have two Jewish high priests. They believe that Luke is wrong here. I don't just believe, I know there's another way to explain that. And then whenever you go over to the book of Acts, we looked at this on and off in our studies in Acts several years ago. They feel that Luke has not been faithful to some of the extra-biblical history that intersects the Acts narrative. Some of his peculiar words that he uses over there. But all I'd say about Luke and criticism is that we have already discussed a lot of that. Most of it concerns the book of Acts. We've already discussed that in all those tapes on the book of Acts. I kept pointing out in later chapters when he used a certain title, a certain designation for local political rulers in an area. He's absolutely precise. He's remarkably precise.
For the continuation of this message,
I kept pointing out in later chapters when he used a certain title, a certain designation for local political rulers in an area. He's absolutely precise. He's remarkably precise. He uses, as a matter of fact, and I proved it on those tapes, he uses terms, a local leader such as the Politarchs in Thessalonica in Acts 17. He uses a term that's so specific, that's so precise and so right and so current, that it may have been the correct title for the local or the Roman leader in that area only for that year, or for maybe the year before and the year after. You see, liberal scholars, critical scholars, have looked back at Luke's titles and they have said, we don't see the rulers in Thessalonica ever call that. And yet you do if you look more closely, only in a very, very specified small era and period of time. And Luke is so up to date, he doesn't use anachronisms. He doesn't just give them any old title that may fit 20 years later or 20 years earlier. He calls them by the name they were called when the event took place. That's how precise he is. And I might also add this about Luke and criticism, that the works of Sir William Ramsay, R-A-M-S-A-Y, I think in about 10 volumes, I have all of those. But the works of Sir William Ramsay, done at the end of last century, he was a noted archaeologist, have done more than anything to defend the reliability of Lucan material. I've got it in about 10 volumes, paperback volumes. Sir William Ramsay. Now, he wasn't right about everything. He believed that, one of the theories of Galatia, whether it's the North Galatian or the South Galatian theory, that the reason Paul went where he was is because in the low coastal areas he caught malaria. And he talks about that in Galatians 4. And he had to go to the higher lands to rid himself of the fever of malaria. I think Ramsay was wrong there. But in uncovering inscriptions and archaeological finds in the end of the last century, he wrote volume after volume after volume. And let me say this about Ramsay. He started off a believer in Lucan criticism, that Luke was wrong. He started off a convinced, confirmed believer that Luke was mistaken. That's what's so beautiful about Ramsay's studies. And his archaeological studies proved him to be wrong and proved the Bible to be right. And as a result, he gave up his earlier criticism and adopted the fact that Luke was right, absolutely, in what he said. In any place that the biblical history intersects extra-biblical history, it doesn't always, but in any place where the two intersect each other, then the Bible could always be confirmed from extra-biblical sources. Such as, for instance, the proconsulship of Gallio in Achaia in Acts, 18? Even in the use, we discussed this in ITP, that there are the Romans in Roman control of the Mediterranean world divided the Mediterranean world up into different provinces. Some were called senatorial, some were called imperial. At the ascension of Caesar Augustus, there were 22 provinces in the Mediterranean world. 10 of those were senatorial, a dozen of those were imperial, and from that time forward, every single province that came into the Roman Empire came in as an imperial province. This is on some earlier ITP tapes. Depending on whether or not it was senatorial versus imperial, different technical names were given to the leaders. Some were proconsuls, some were procurators, prefects, some were legates. Luke sometimes uses a general word such as governor over in Luke chapter 2. Whenever he's writing about a senatorial province, which he does in chapter 13 and in chapter 18, he uses the correct name for the leader, a proconsul. One Sergius Paulus in chapter 13 and another Gallio in chapter 18. All right? Well, let me just show you that in chapter 13 since he does it twice. In chapter 13, this is on the island of Cyprus, which was a senatorial, not an imperial province. Imperial provinces had legates over them. That's what Quirinius was in Syria. And Syria was the province that included Judea. Acts 13:7, which was with the, now here's just an English word, deputy, like a deputy sheriff. That's an English term. The Greek behind this, which was the proconsul of the country, Sergius Paulus. That's exactly what he was. You can only call a Roman leader a proconsul if he was over a senatorial province. Luke is exactly right. Chapter 18 and verse 12. When Gallio was the deputy, same Greek term again, proconsul of Achaia, the southern division and portion of Greece, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. All right, so there's just one example. Luke is right in his selection of terms. He calls, I mentioned earlier, the leaders in Thessalonica in Acts 17 and verse 6, which the KJV translates as the rulers of the city. He calls them politarchs. That's exactly what they're called, but only for a short, specified period of time in Thessalonica. And the same is just true over and over. So much for Lucan criticism. All right, number 5, redaction criticism. Redaction criticism. This was a revolt against the piecemeal process of form criticism. And it came into its own after the Second World War. These others are mid to late 19th century, early 20th century. Redaction criticism gets up into the mid 20th century, up into some of your lifetimes. After the Second World War, redaction criticism. Conzelman was a leader in this field. Conzelmann. See, some of these names and terms are new to you now. Conzelman. Conzelman, a leader in this field, acknowledged that the Gospels, so we're back to the Gospels, were unified productions. They weren't just a collection of a lot of orally transmitted stories. They're unified productions, later edited by writers to express a certain theological position. Now we can go back to our 4 sits and livens here. You've got, first of all, the situation of the event actually happening. That's the first sits and livens. You got the spelling, I'll erase this. Then with form Geschichte, with form criticism, you've got your second situation, because what they're concerned about is, well, we know the event took place, but no one wrote it down. They talked about it for a long time. They passed it down orally. Okay? Then, eventually, that was written down. That's what form Geschichte is all about. And then we come down here to redaction criticism, and they say, no, what we have is, let's take the Gospel of Mark. We've got the Gospel of Mark. It's a unified whole. It's not really a composition of various orally transmitted traditional stories. It's a unified document, a unified whole. But after Mark wrote, let's just say that Mark wrote in the year 50 A.D., just to give ourselves some figures here. After Mark wrote, what we have in Mark is not this Mark here. That was an earlier Mark. What we have in Mark is the work of a later redactor who went back and corrected Mark's gospel and then gave us our third sitz in Libin, the situation in which the redactor was living. What made him go back and rearrange Mark to express a certain theological stance? Those are sometimes called your three sitz in Libins. Don't worry about some of those terms, though. Now, redaction criticism, take a note of this, is the thing which has most excited the evangelical world today. Evangelicals aren't too much in source form looking criticism. They believe that those are erroneous avenues. Evangelicals have, I think, entered somewhat of a love affair with redaction criticism, trying to piece together what they think the original Gospel of Matthew, the original Gospel of Mark said before it was dirtied by the hands of a redactor. But who's to say, though, when you don't have the original? It's just one scholar's mind against another. I don't know. The Lord may lead for us not to go into all this in much more detail, because who's to say? I mean, I'm saying none of these things are right here. It's just one scholar's mind against another. Robert Gundry, I'm going to mention one of his books here in a moment. He wrote a New Testament introduction book that was used for several years. Robert Gundry got his little self kicked out of the Evangelical Theological Society for dabbling in redaction criticism. In his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, his, I forget the full title, but it's a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, his Theological Art in something. That's about 700 pages, 600 or 700 pages, telling us what he thinks is midrashic, that is, what he thinks Matthew has embellished. He's added his own embellishments in. He teaches, I think he still does, at an evangelical school, member of the Evangelical Society, and written papers and everything, and they took a vote, spearheaded by one of the professors down at Dallas Theological Seminary, Norman Geisler, spearheaded by Norman, and they kicked him out of the Evangelical Theological Society because they didn't believe that his extreme use of redaction criticism is warranted by the New Testament. But he's just the best-known example over the last few years, Robert Gundry, of an evangelical, a former conservative, who has fallen in love with redaction criticism. But I'm finding too many other evangelicals are falling in love with this, and I don't know why. Just stay with what you have in the Word. Put together the best you can from textual criticism and make sure you have, as far as you know, the right text, but you can't get back any earlier than that. All right, then number 6, we've got the Kerugma school. Now here's a term that if I've seen it once, I've seen it 1,000 times. I don't know that I've ever mentioned it around here. But we might as well go ahead and familiarize ourselves with it. Well, you have it spelled for you there. It comes from kerugma in Greek. That's just right. It comes from a verb, keruso in Greek. But there's the noun, kerugma, which is K-E-R, it's really a U. G-M-A. K-E-R-U-G-M-A. You say, why you spell it with a Y? Because everybody else does. That's just what you're supposed to do. But then you don't know how to pronounce it. It's a U. But that's the way everybody spells it. But they think that a Y is what transliterates a upsilon in Greek. But a U is better. At least that way you're left with something to pronounce. All right, have you ever heard of that term before? Kerugma, you've seen it before, I'm sure. If you've seen it before, you come across it all the time. Kerugmatic preaching, or the kerugmatic message or something. You might not have known how to pronounce it. It's just nothing but an English transliteration of a Greek term. If I've seen it once, I've seen it over 1,000 times in my reading. You just see it all the time. So what does it mean? It means proclamation. It means proclamation, or really a better term, so we can contrast it with something else, it means preaching. Oh, this is pretty involved. Let me say what I've got in my notes so I don't get off track here, and then I may add some more things. This is another, like redaction criticism, another alternative to form criticism. And this was introduced by the British scholar C.H. Dodd. Now, if you're really keeping up, you might say, I thought you gave us C.H. Dodd's name under form criticism. All right? And now you're saying that he fits under the Kerygma school because this is an alternative to form criticism. So how can he fit under both? Well, he thought form criticism was right for a while. And then he said, no, I don't think that'll work. So he gave that up, and he went to the Kerygma school. So in other words, Dodd is unreliable in a lot of areas. Dodd said this evangelistic Kerygma was designed to make converts and was completely different from the Christian Didache, which was the teaching of the church. This is an explanation on how we end up with the New Testament. So you often hear this, and no one, I don't think anyway, is intending some reference to technical, former, higher critical, liberal, Kerygma school thinking, but you often hear of a difference between preaching, and I guess there is some difference, and teaching. So up here would be your Kerygma word, and down here would be your Didache word, which is just a word that means doctrine or teaching. Now, what the proponents of this school, and many evangelicals also believe in this, by the way, the Kerygma criticism. What they believe here is that the Kerygma was the bare outline of the gospel, which would include these things, transmitted orally: Christ's life, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension. Christ's life, death, resurrection, and ascension. That's Kerygma. That's what the early church went preaching. And they have some verses like 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Romans chapter 15, and 1 Corinthians 15. Let me just read that little section to you. This, they say, is good Kerygma, and this is probably, they would say, an outline of early Christian preaching. Verse 3 of 1 Corinthians 15, For I delivered unto you first of all that which also I received, how that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures. He was buried, he rose again the third day, according to the Scriptures, that he was seen of Cephas, the 12, James, all the apostles, last of all, he was seen by me. In other words, you just have the bare outline of the Christian message, although it's the most important part of it. Then gradually, as church history moved along, the story had to be filled in with other sayings, parables, healings from Jesus' life and ministry, which of course were dreamed up by the people. They were myths to fill in some of the blank spaces. They would say this then is how we got our New Testament, basically the four Gospels. This is how we got our four Gospels. You have the bare outline of the Kerygma being preached, basically the atonement and so forth of Christ. And then the church later in history is not satisfied with that, and so you have some unscrupulous men, but perhaps ones that are desirous of the edification of the church, who go back and fill in that basic Kerygma, the preaching and the proclamation of the gospel, with various other stories and sayings and healings and parables and events in Jesus' earthly life. And then one final form of criticism is, for lack of a better term, called eschatological historical criticism. Eschatological historical criticism. We go back to the Tübingen School, you'll remember F.C. Bauer. two of Bauer's most famous pupils were, number one, David Strauss, who wrote a book in 1835 entitled Life of Jesus. And Albrecht Ritschl, Ritschl. Now these were there was another one, Zeller, I think, but these were the two most famous pupils of Bauer. Both of them agreed with Bauer to begin with. Both of them parted company with Bauer later in their life. Albrecht Ritschl is important for other reasons. For right now, the important one is David Strauss. He wrote a block-busting book in 1835 entitled The Life of Jesus, which began, well, really something happened earlier, but it popularized the ancient so-called quest of the historical Jesus. Who was the Jesus of history? We only have the Jesus of faith in the Bible, with the embellished stories and myths attached to him. Who was the real man, the Jesus of history, the man who walked the dusty lanes of Galilee? Well, that went through its heyday in the mid-19th century. We've seen this earlier in C.S. Lewis' Screwtape Letters. We talked about the quest of the historical Jesus, and we'll see it again in other studies. All of that came to a climactic end in 1906 when a startling new book from Germany was published by Albert Schweitzer, appropriately enough called, this was its English name, it had even a more interesting German name that I'd have to tell you some other people and figures if I gave that to you. I won't do that now, but entitled The Quest of the Historical Jesus. I have that in my library. He felt that this whole business that just enamored liberal German scholars of the mid-19th century, the quest of the historical Jesus, was nothing but a farce. Because if you do what they desire to do, you've got to get behind the New Testament stories and accounts, which means basically you deny their historicity and reliability. Then what do you have to go on? You don't have anything to go on. We don't have any other documents but the New Testament books. So he said what you're doing is you're producing a self-defeating system. But he was a liberal. He also desired to get behind the stories of the Gospels and try to understand the real man Jesus. So here was his theory. He felt that Jesus thought that the kingdom of God was soon to appear on earth. That was the dominant theme of his parables. That the kingdom of God was soon to break in on man's history. He also felt that he would be the new Messiah in that kingdom. But when his expectation failed to materialize, he, speaking of Jesus still, Schweitzer would say, he became convinced that he would have to die. But he held hope that God might raise him from the dead. God didn't, because miracles are impossible. And so his apostles went around and embellished the account by saying that he did. That's the only way they could win any converts. So that's called the eschatological historical branch of criticism. That Jesus thought he was going to be a new messianic king. The kingdom of God was soon to break in. He was misguided and deluded in his thoughts. He died a martyr for his own cause. The apostles went and told lies about him. So if all that's true, that really affects how we're going to read the New Testament. I think I'd close it up if all that was true. But it really will affect New Testament introduction, because they basically went telling lies. Okay, so enough on those forms of criticism. Now, in conclusion tonight, the next thing on our outline is to look at liberal and conservative scholars. Well, I just mentioned a lot of liberals, right, in all those forms of criticism. But I want to mention specifically some of them again, and just some others, to give you a list of liberals so that when you come across these names, you'll know I know some people think this is unfair to pigeonhole people like it, but it's not, and we're going to do it anyway. Their works testify to their liberalism. So when you come across these men, you'll know whether or not you're dealing with a liberal versus a conservative. Such as, and just to give you for instance, when I first got into all this and began studying, I didn't know Strauss from Ritchell from Rawls. I didn't know these people. So you find out someone wrote a book called such and such, Life of Jesus. Well, that sounds like a good Christian book. Sounds like one I'd want to own, The Life of Jesus. Strauss, that's a decent name, I guess, David Strauss. I didn't know anything about it. So it helps knowing all these names. So when you find out, it sounded like a good book. Who wrote it? He wrote. I wouldn't even have it. I'd have it start a fire with in the fireplace. That's about all. It helps to know, who the authors are and who is good and who is bad. So here's a list of some of the bad ones. All right? Some of these books, some of the men have books that are still available and some are not. First of all, I'll mention the two Bowers, Bruno and F.C. Bauer. Now, I wrote this 5 years ago. You remember that as I go over some of these names here. Adolf Harnack, most famous 19th century German church historian. Harnack, Harnack. James Moffat. These are liberal New Testament scholars. Souter, Souter. Lake and Lake, Lake, two men by the name of Lake. Lake and Lake, again in church history. Peake, Peake, such as in Peake's one-volume commentary. Goodspeed, English Bible translator. C.H. Dodd. R.H. Lightfoot. Rudolf Bultmann. Now, Bultmann, I'll mention two of his writings. New Testament Theology, which I have, which won't really affect us right here in NT Intro. Rudolf Bultmann. And secondly, The History of the Synoptic Tradition. That's the English name and translation. The History of the Synoptic Tradition. Some of you may have never even heard of the term synoptic before tonight, so I know that I may have overloaded some of you. But you'll catch on and pick it up as we go along. Bultmann is best known for his theory of demythologizing the Gospels, based on a paper he published, I think it was 1941, which was entitled New Testament and Mythology. He read an astounding paper that shocked the audience, that started the demythologizing process. Bultmann had two disciples who were certainly more radical than he himself was, but be that as it may, he's best known for his theory of demythologizing. But notice what we're saying, demythologizing the Gospels, taking the myths out, the miracles, the healings, the demoniacs, taking the myths out of the New Testament. Then another man who's very famous, I have this book also in my library. I found this just a few years ago, as a matter of fact, at a used bookstore up in Rutland. B.H. Streeter. This was a hard book to find for me. I looked for it for a long time. B.H. Streeter with a book entitled The Four Gospels, 1924. He is best known for what's called the four-document theory of the Synoptic Gospels, and you'll become familiar with that as we go along. I notice I keep having to say, you'll become familiar with this as we go along. That's unusual because you already know a lot of things. So it's unusual to find a whole new area that's really with many stones unturned. Then we've got conservative scholars. These would be such people like J.B. Lightfoot, Alford, Westcott, he's got a commentary on Hebrews and a commentary on John. A.T. Robertson. New Testament intro itself. The most famous conservative one from last century, or really the very beginning of this century, is in a 3-volume set entitled Introduction to the New Testament by Theodore Zahn. Now, names that I mention now are also conservative. Z-A-H-N. Another one that's on the market that a lot of people like, Jensen's Survey of the New Testament. The New Testament, its background, growth, and content by Bruce Metzger. That won't always be as conservative as you would like. And here's one of the good old standards that has been around for probably 30 years. Henry Thiessen's Introduction to the New Testament, published by Erdman's. If it's still in print today, you couldn't go wrong owning Thiessen's Introduction to the New Testament. He has other books, such as Lectures in Systematic Theology. I think that's the first systematic theology book I ever read, was Thiessen's Lectures in Systematics. Then you've got a Mennonite scholar who in 3 volumes has an Introduction to the New Testament. D. Edmund Hibert. He teaches in a school out in California. H-I-E-B-E-R-T. He's a Mennonite scholar. You've got Gundry's Survey of the New Testament. He's the one that got kicked out of ETS for his Midrashic Matthew commentary and delving into redaction criticism. Now, this was written back in his conservative days. New Testament Survey, this was used by a lot of undergraduate Bible colleges, by Gromeke, Robert Gromeke. He took some degrees from both Grace Seminary and Dallas Seminary, so he's fairly reliable, conservative, dispensational, premillennialist, so he's fairly reliable. Robert Gromeke. Another one that's been around a long time, Introduction to the New Testament by Everett Harrison. Then when it comes to the New Testament, I guess what I'd recommend, only because it's just the standard, but others are equally good, such as Harrison's and Thiessen's, especially Harrison's, is Merle Tenney's New Testament Survey. And then finally tonight, the big grandfather of them all, which is one you may not want to get into, it's 1,000 pages, is Guthrie's New Testament Intro. Guthrie's New Testament Intro, Donald Guthrie.